Schwerpunkt und Bewegungskrieg. History books love the word Blitzkrieg, but for the men inside the German High Command, that was nothing more than a flashy, shallow headline for Western newspapers. In the smoke-filled war rooms of Berlin, they spoke of Bewegungskrieg, the relentless, cold art of maneuver warfare. This wasn't some lightning bolt of genius suddenly discovered in 1939. It was a brutal, high-speed evolution of Prussian traditions, now fueled by high-octane gasoline and coordinated through the humming circuits of FM radios. It was old-world aggression meets new-world machine. The steel heart of this doctrine was the Schwerpunkt, the decisive center of gravity. The Wehrmacht didn't believe in fair fights or balanced lines across a front. If a front stretched for hundreds of miles, German commanders ignored 99% of it. They looked for the single weakest link. Then they jammed every available panzer, motorized regiment, and screaming Stuka into a corridor just 2 miles to 5 miles wide. It was a violent hammer blow to a single nail. By the time the dust settled, they had driven a steel wedge straight through the enemy's crust, making local resistance entirely irrelevant. Once the breach was torn open, the mission shifted from killing to total paralysis. German panzer divisions didn't get bogged down in petty firefights with bypassed units. They exploited the gap, racing 40 miles to 50 miles deep into the rear every single day. It was a psychological collapse as much as a physical one. While French or Polish generals waited for motorcycle couriers to deliver handwritten reports, a process that took hours, German spearheads were already capturing supply depots and severing telephone lines 30 miles behind the supposed front. The secret weapon wasn't just the tank, it was the radio. Every vehicle, from the light Panzer II to the heavy command trucks, carried a transmitter. This allowed for real-time tactical shifts that their enemies simply couldn't track or counter. A commander could spot a hidden anti-tank screen 2 miles out, call in a dive bomber strike, and flank the position in minutes. This digital speed coordination in an analog world allowed Bewegungskrieg to turn the battlefield into a fluid race. The Allies weren't just outgunned. They were outpaced by a military culture that made decisions faster than they could process the disaster unfolding around them. Kesselschlacht. The logical conclusion of a successful breakthrough was not a simple pursuit, but the Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battle. Once the panzers shattered the enemy's crust at the Schwerpunkt, they didn't just drive toward the horizon, they performed a massive, sweeping pincer movement. 2 armored spearheads would race into the open rear, curving toward each other until they met, snapping shut a trap that could encompass thousands of square miles. The goal was total encirclement, transforming a fluid front line into a static, hopeless pocket where the enemy was cut off from all food, fuel, and hope. This doctrine reached its terrifying zenith at the Battle of Kiev in 1941. Inside a massive pocket, the Wehrmacht trapped an astonishing 665,000 Soviet soldiers, a number roughly equivalent to the entire modern population of Boston, all squeezed into a tightening ring of steel. While the panzers provided the outer shell, the true weight of the battle fell on the German infantry. To keep the cauldron from leaking, these soldiers had to march on foot for over 25 miles a day, often through suffocating dust or knee-deep mud, carrying 60 pounds of equipment. The scale of human suffering within these pockets was so immense that at the height of the battle, the density of the trapped Soviet forces was so high that German artillery batteries didn't even need to aim. They simply fired into the masses, knowing every shell would find a target. However, the cauldron was a double-edged sword that eventually blunted the German sword. Every successful encirclement required hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition to maintain, stretching the supply lines to a breaking point. As the pockets grew larger, the German ring became dangerously thin, with single battalions sometimes responsible for holding several miles of the perimeter. The panzers, designed for rapid movement, often found themselves sedentary, forced to sit and guard prisoners for weeks rather than exploiting their speed. This strategic friction meant that with every great victory, the German army actually became slower and more vulnerable, ultimately drowning in the sheer vastness of the territory they attempted to swallow. Universal machine gun. In the early 1940s, the tactical heartbeat of a German infantry platoon was not the bolt-action rifle, but a single, lethal masterpiece of stamped steel weighing exactly 25 pounds. The MG-42 was not just an improvement over previous designs. It was a psychological weapon engineered for total battlefield dominance. While American and British machine guns fired at a rhythmic, manageable pace, the MG-42 unleashed a terrifying torrent of 1,200 rounds per minute. This rate of fire was so extreme that individual gunshots blurred into a continuous, guttural roar, earning it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. To a soldier pinned down in a ditch, the sound didn't resemble gunfire so much as the violent ripping of thick canvas or linoleum. This mechanical ferocity forced the Wehrmacht to rebuild their entire infantry doctrine from the ground up. In the United States military, the squad was built around the individual rifleman and his semi-automatic M1 Garand. However, the German squad functioned as a mobile life support system for the machine gun. Every man in the unit, from the non-commissioned officer to the ammunition bearers, existed primarily to ensure the MG-42 never stopped singing. Because the friction of firing generated heat in excess of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the barrel would become dangerously white-hot after only a few hundred rounds. To counter this, German engineers developed a genius quick-change system. A seasoned two-man crew could swap a glowing barrel for a fresh one in a mere 6 seconds, ensuring the curtain of lead remained constant while Allied troops were still trying to maneuver. The versatility of this weapon allowed it to dominate at any range. On its integrated bipod, it provided devastating suppressive fire for squads on the move. But when mounted on the heavy Lafette tripod, which featured a sophisticated optical sight and recoil-absorbing buffers, it transformed into a long-range sniper platform. From this stable base, a gunner could accurately harass enemy movements at distances exceeding 1,100 yards. The most remarkable aspect of this 1942 design is its terrifying efficiency. It consumed ammunition so rapidly that a single gunner could burn through a standard 250-round belt in just 12 seconds. Yet its mechanical DNA was so perfect that modern NATO forces still utilize the MG3, virtually the same weapon, proving that the Germans had effectively mastered the physics of automatic fire over 80 years ago. Stoßtruppen. When the panzers hit the concrete labyrinths of cities like Stalingrad, the open field race died. The battlefield became claustrophobic and terrifying. Massive armored sweeps were replaced by the surgical savagery of the Stoßtruppen, or stormtroopers. No more clunky battalions. The infantry fractured into small, lethal squads designed for high-intensity, house-to-house brawling. These were the human bulldozers of the Wehrmacht. Every cellar, attic, and sewer pipe became a tactical objective where the line between life and death was measured in mere inches. It was a savage war of nerves, grenades, and knives. The key to surviving this hell was a chilling method called hugging the enemy. German commanders knew the Soviets' greatest advantage was their massive artillery, capable of leveling city blocks in minutes. To negate this, Stoßtruppen squads stayed as physically close to the Soviet lines as possible, sometimes just on the opposite side of a single interior brick wall. By maintaining a constant gap of only 30 feet to 50 feet, they created a tactical stalemate. Soviet heavy guns couldn't fire without vaporizing their own men in the process. This intimate slaughter required a specialized toolkit. Soldiers ditched heavy rucksacks for as many as 10 potato masher grenades tucked into their belts and boots. The violence was so raw that many discarded their precision rifles entirely, preferring sharpened entrenching tools and serrated knives for silent, dark kills in the ruins. Armed with the rapid-fire MP40 and flamethrowers, projecting fire over 30 yards, these troops turned the Rat War into a masterclass of urban terror. They proved that German tactical adaptability wasn't limited to the plains. It could be just as lethal in a basement. This total transition from panzer maneuvers to savage urban fighting showed the Wehrmacht's dark flexibility when their machines were neutralized. Panzerkeil and Pakfront. On the vast open steppes of the Eastern Front, tank warfare evolved into a cold, geometric discipline. The Germans pioneered the Panzerkeil, or armored wedge, a formation specifically designed to penetrate even the deepest Soviet defensive belts. At the very tip of this steel arrowhead were the heavy hitters, the Tiger tanks. With frontal armor plating up to 4 inches thick and the legendary 88mm KWK-36 gun, the Tiger acted as an invulnerable shield. Behind this heavy lead element, the more agile Panther and Panzer IV tanks fanned out to protect the Tiger's thinner 3-inch side armor from flanking maneuvers. This allowed the formation to absorb incoming hits while systematically picking off enemy targets from a safe distance of 2,000 yards, ensuring the breakthrough could be exploited by the motorized infantry following close behind. However, as the war progressed and resources dwindled, the Germans became equally legendary for their defensive masterclass known as the Pakfront. They realized that scattering anti-tank guns individually across a wide front made them easy targets to be destroyed one by one. Instead, they grouped as many as 10 to 15 guns under a single commanding officer who coordinated their fire like a symphony of destruction. These guns, often the deadly 75mm Pak-40, were buried deep into the earth and meticulously camouflaged with local vegetation until they were virtually invisible to the naked eye. The crews were forbidden from firing at long range, maintaining a nerve-wracking, absolute silence as Soviet armor rumbled toward them. The discipline required for a Pakfront was absolute. The commander would wait until the enemy tanks entered a kill zone, typically under 250 yards, where the high velocity of their rounds ensured maximum penetration through the thickest armor. At the precise moment of engagement, every gun in the battery would fire at a single lead tank simultaneously, creating a concentrated kinetic impact so violent that it could literally blow the turret off a T-34 before the rest of the Soviet formation even realized they were under fire. This lethal coordination turned German defensive lines into a series of fire bags, where dozens of tanks could be incinerated in a matter of seconds, effectively blunting the massed armored charges that defined the final years of the conflict. Elastic defense and hedgehog. By mid-1943, the Wehrmacht's confidence was bleeding out across the East. They were no longer confident conquerors, but desperate defenders clinging to survival. This shift forced the refinement of elastic defense, a fluid tactical philosophy that traded physical space for precious time. The front was no longer a rigid, unbreakable wall, it was a flexible rubber band. German commanders realized that holding every yard of earth was a certain death sentence against the Red Army's overwhelming numerical mass. When a massive Soviet artillery barrage was imminent, the Germans didn't stay to die in the mud. Instead, they executed a disciplined withdrawal several miles back to a secondary, concealed defensive belt just minutes before the first heavy shells landed. This calculated retreat left the enemy pounding empty trenches with thousands of tons of explosives. It was a ghost defense. The genius of this move was the absolute precision of the timing. As the enemy infantry stumbled across the cratered wasteland, exhausted and unsupported by their distant guns, fresh German reserves would strike from the shadows, crushing the offensive before it could ever settle. But if the front shattered completely under pressure, they turned to the Eaglestellung, or hedgehog defense. Units stopped retreating and consolidated into vital hubs like railway junctions or fortified stone villages. They created permanent, 360-degree defensive perimeters, effectively transforming towns into autonomous steel islands. These hedgehogs were bristling with MG-42s and high-velocity anti-tank guns. They could survive surrounded for weeks on end. Each strongpoint had deep stockpiles of fuel and ammunition to endure a prolonged, bloody siege. This resilience meant that every yard the Allies reclaimed was bought with a staggering blood tax. These isolated garrisons refused to surrender, effectively paralyzing enemy momentum and cutting supply lines from the rear. It was a cold, hard strategy designed to bleed the attacker dry at any cost. By the war's end, the hedgehog became a symbol of German stubbornness, turning every crossroads into a fortress that demanded a heavy price in lives for every single step toward Berlin. Scherm. The German tactical revolution reached its absolute zenith in the clouds, where the Luftwaffe shattered aerial formations that had remained stagnant since the dawn of military flight. During the brutal testing ground of the Spanish Civil War, elite pilots discovered that the traditional three-plane V formation was dangerously stiff, restrictive, and often fatal in high-speed combat. This realization birthed the Schwarm, or Finger Four formation, a revolutionary setup that mimicked the natural positions of fingertips on an outstretched hand. It utilized two independent pairs called Rotten, flying with wide tactical spacing that often exceeded 600 feet. This specific gap allowed pilots to scan the vast horizon for threats at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour without the constant fear of a mid-air collision, providing a level of situational awareness that made the tighter Allied formations look like easy, clustered targets. They maximized vision and lethality in a way the world had never seen. The beating heart of this aerial system was Auftragstactik, or mission-type command. German pilots weren't shackled by rigid, minute-by-minute orders dictated from a distant, disconnected headquarters. Instead, they were given a clear strategic objective and total freedom to use their own tactical initiative to achieve it. While one pilot focused entirely on the kill, his wingman stayed slightly behind and to the flank, scanning the 6 o'clock position to protect the leader's vulnerable tail from any sudden ambush. This autonomy made the Luftwaffe unpredictable, fast, and incredibly lethal during the early years of the war. Thanks for joining this deep dive into World War II tactics. We truly appreciate your curiosity and passion for history. If these technical details hit the mark, drop a comment below. Should we cover U-boat Wolfpack tactics or the Allied responses next? Today, the DNA of the Schwarm remains the gold standard for every elite air force on the planet, including the U.S. Air Force. It is a lasting legacy of a military system designed for maximum individual autonomy and mutual support. These concepts prove that while regimes fall, the hard, cold logic of effective maneuver warfare is timeless. Tactical brilliance continues to define high-tech battlefields in the 21st century, showing that speed, flexibility, and coordination will always reign supreme in the theater of war.